Hi everyone, this is Bart Wijstra from FHIR. I'll be the moderator for this session. Thank you very much for joining. We'll be hearing from two of the primary authors of the US Core specification and members of the Argonaut team on the USCDI and US Core. Later in this talk, we'll hear from Eric Haas, who is a consultant at Health eData Inc. But we'll start giving the floor to Brett Marquard, who is a principal at Wave 1 Associates. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Ward, and thanks for having us. So we're excited to have DevDays kicked off, and Eric and I are ready for a great session here. So I know Ward gave a brief intro, but Eric can't help but add, subject matter expert for Argonaut and the Da Vinci guides. But one of the jokes at HL7 is he writes the most beautiful implementation guides. So if you're reading the guide and it flows perfectly, likely Eric had a hand in it, and I feel very lucky to have worked with Eric the past 5 years. So I'm Brett, lots of EHR experience, also prime editor and the Argonaut project manager. So let's get started here. Why does this USCDI Argonaut US Core thing matter? And the idea is, these provide foundational guidance for access to clinical data. The end goal is to improve clinical outcomes, and whether, and to do that, enabling access to patients and providers and payers and the whole mix of people. And that's ultimately what this guide and community that we'll talk about today does. It got a big boost through something ONC did in their CARES Act final rule. So, this latest regulation in 2020 had all sorts of good golden nuggets in it, and one of them was the US Core 311 IG. So certified health IT systems are required to support the FHIR Core or US Core 311. And so if you're a client app developer or someone with a health data store, it doesn't necessarily fall underneath this regulatory requirement. It's important to note that you may not, but it's a good place to look if you want to figure out what maybe many other systems are going to support or are working to support. And so the importance of US Core isn't just for folks who are certified, but it's folks who are looking to access data in the US marketplace, and also beyond, international marketplace, look at some of the key data elements we selected in the US. So we'll talk a little about what the Argonauts are, the importance of profiles, specifically the US Core profiles, US Core and the US Core data for interoperability, and then where we're headed in the future. So up first, what is this Argonaut project, or term you heard? We've been around for 5 years, and it's a growing community, and it's a community that's focused on collaborating between leading technology vendors, provider organizations to accelerate the use of FHIR in healthcare exchange. It's not a separate private organization, not a proprietary activity. We're not a standards development organization. That's HL7's space, what they're experts at. But we really are a community to test out high priority use cases. One thing you'll see if you look over the history of the Argonaut project is, we don't have the not invented here attitude. If another project, smart, has some great project that they're working on, we're happy to join in and get dirty and try to advance that particular project. So it's been a great project over the past several years, and been an example for other communities to form around HL7's accelerator program. As you see, Da Vinci and Gravity and a whole suite of others that have formed in the past years. So who's a part of it? A whole set of leading technology vendors across a whole variety of markets in consumer health and EHR space, payer space, even beyond, and some provider organizations to provide the clinical input, boots on the ground, real world examples as we work through some of these use cases. The staffing behind it, some familiar names, Graham, been involved since the beginning, and Josh and Eric and myself, with a few others, Gino and Carl floating in and out. And of course, tip of the hat to, Mickey, now our ONC national coordinator, was the founding, led the charge to found Argonaut, and was the project manager from its beginning until recently taking that new role. So what does the Argonaut project actually do? The FHIR specification is a big spec, and I think if you're brand new to FHIR, you're in a great place, because DevDays, take a step back and soak it all in. There's a lot to learn this week, but it's easy to become overwhelmed. And I think, you know, new readers to FHIR, there's so many features and so many pieces, it's hard to know what people are actually going to implement. And so the Argonaut process, what we've really tried to do is say, okay, let's sit around the table, let's talk about what are you actually going to implement. There's a whole suite of search criteria, and there's only a subset that we're all actually going to implement. So, you know, maybe you'll do it all, but across the spectrum, we haven't seen that to be the case. And so let's agree on the minimum set we're all going to implement. And then let's talk about what data will actually return when we support that search criteria. And then that key last piece is, you know, what content will be included in that response. You know, the patient resource has dozens of elements, but let's make sure that we agree on the core set that will always be there. And for procedures, maybe the terminology, or for conditions, you know, which vocabulary that we'll include when we talk about classifying problems. And as a result of this process, we produced this thing called the Argonaut Data Query Implementation Guide. So if you're doing FHIR DS22 work, I know, you know, some of us still are out there doing that. This guide provided the access to the common clinical data set. So a key set of clinical resources and information to get things rolling. Vendors progressed from FHIR DS22. Some did R3, some skipped R3 and went straight to R4. And so this guide is primarily for DS22, but provided the requirements, kind of the baseline setup for a creation of a formal standard at HL7 called the US Core. And so US FHIR Core is a labeled subset of HL7 US realm produced FHIR profiles. It's meant to be a single point of reference for folks who are looking for foundational US profiles and intended to support a wide variety of stakeholders implementing FHIR. So it's not just for clinical, it's meant to support payer. And the last few years, we've gotten some good feedback from the payer community on how to improve them to make them more foundational for the use cases. And still have some more work to do there, but the idea is that they're foundational for others to build off of across the US realm. For public health, for quality reporting, the whole mix of use cases that healthcare data is used for. So just bottom line, to kind of kick this off, the Argonaut IG that we first created, you know, we had a FHIR DS22, we did some FHIR R4 work, but we formalized this all through the standard at HL7 called the US Core. Built from Argonaut requirements. There are versions for STU3. We had kind of minimal uptake on that, or I shouldn't say minimal. We had a few vendors pick it up, but not as broad as the DS22 and R4 versions. There is some background, of course, in this project called the Data Access Framework for folks who want the full history, but it's all kind of fed through the Argonaut community before formalization at HL7. And with that, I'm going to let Eric start to walk through the guide and talk through some of the details. Eric. Eric's working his way off mute here, and as he does it, you'll see.
Yes, oh, there we go. Okay.
There you go. Hey, there you are.
I started diving into it. Okay, so for a little brief history and some context and kind of segue from Brett's part of the presentation here. See how US Core has grown. So we started at Argonaut DS22. I think that was in 2015 that was published. It published in 2015. And we had a total of 17 profiles there as one metric. And we've grown to 27 profiles in US Core 3.1.1. And in our most recent version, we'll talk about this at the end of the talk, we have a recently ballot version, and that's going to have 35 profiles. So it keeps growing and growing. So this is a growing and dynamic project. So as far as looking at just as a broad overview, I'm going to spend a little time on this slide. As a broad overview to US Core, it's focused on two things: profile and search. It's a lot about search and a heck of a lot about profiles. The overall goal for US Core was to be permissive, to prescribe the minimal set of requirements for interoperability, and allow, you know, implementers to expand that and extend that however they wanted to. So there's a lot of focus in US Core on profiles because they define the structure and the content of what you're getting, the data you're getting. And so we look at what's required, what codes to use, and then something called, we have on the left-hand side of this slide, we have profiles, but we have something called extensions. So we actually define what extensions to use in a particular profile, because not everything's in the FHIR-based specification. There are things, believe it or not, there are things that are specific to United States and not that people in other countries don't care about. So we do have US-specific extensions in there as well. And then, like I mentioned before, the second biggest piece about this is search. we're going to go back to that slide. Just going to finish this up here. So we have search. So search is the interaction between the clients and the servers to access and use the data. So we have defined not only in the guide the structure, but also the interactions. Okay, so let's go. So we can go on now. So there, you technically don't need a profile to use FHIR. You could just use the base specification out of the box and use the approach that we outline here in the slide. You know, those bottom three bullets. However, but the FHIR resources are loaded with data elements and unconstrained in such a way that it makes it very difficult to interoperate. When I say interoperate, I think about what, in a very simple sense, I think of it very simply, patients should have a reasonable expectation of what type of information they get, no matter which provider they get it from, right? So you should have a baseline of things that you're always going to get. But if we just stuck with FHIR, there's so many options, so many, and everything's open that I think you wouldn't have that. So out of the box, using FHIR doesn't seem to be the way to go. So we chose to use the profiling way to do this. And so looking at, for example, the base condition resource, you can see there's a lot of elements. Very little constraints to those elements. They're all kind of optional. And if you even look at some code systems in there, you can see that the codes are optional. It's an example code set. So there's really no constraints or no guidance given here to kind of put some, what are they called? The guardrails on the highway so you can go in a straight line instead of just going in circles. So yeah, so we came up with a set of profiles early on in Argonaut DSU2 and trying to define the baseline of 17 profiles to define some constraints on each one of them, so we have an expectation when you're a client, you know the kind of information you get. Here's an example of the US Core Condition profile, and here we can see it's now simple to read. We've kind of narrowed those many elements down to a few elements and said these are the ones we expect to see. And we also have, if you look at this as basically a tree view, just a quick reference. This is called a formal view of it, and I see it all the time, every day. So for me, it's automatic to look at it. But I'll just kind of walk through it. We have this tree, and on the left-hand side, you have the different elements. We have condition under that. We have these 5 elements: clinical status, verification status, category, code, and subject. And as you go across in each row, you can see the metadata about each element. So we have that little red S, which means you must support this, which means in common everyday language, that means, if that S is there, it means if you're a system and you have this, you got to be able to send this data if you have it. You may not always have it, but when you have it, always represent that in this resource. And then the next one over there is how many instances of this are there. The big thing with that is if it's mandatory, it's going to be a one dot something, and if it's not, it's going to be 0. And then we describe this. Now we're getting deep into FHIR, and I'm probably going to skip here. But the next one is data types. There's a lot of data types in FHIR. And then finally, on the other side, the important thing on the last column is we've defined a lot of value sets for US Core. So we've said these are the codes. If you're using a code, these are the codes we want you to use, or these are the codes that you should be using. Or these are the codes that you got to use unless you have a different code that doesn't fit the set. So we've done a lot of work in terminology as well. So as you can see, we've taken something that's really had no boundaries and kind of made a narrow road to go down and try to increase interoperability that way. So taking another look, a deeper dive into a profile here. In each profile, if you look in US Core and you crack it open and you look at a profile, you're going to have several sections. You're going to have this first section, which is we strove to create clear, concise, human readable narrative to introduce the profile elements, just to try to create a simple language, say this is what's here, and then in addition to that, we actually say this is what you got to have, this is what you should have, and then we have some specific guidance for each of these profiles. There's always a lot of caveats and issues that we feel are important enough that we should bring those up in a special section. And then below that, we have the formal definition, which I just talked about in the previous slide that describes it. And then we have this thing called a quick start, because as I mentioned before, US Core is about profiles, about the structural content and elements, plus the interaction, how to get the data, how are you going to get this data? and what the API is going to be. So we have in two parts in a quick start. Generally, we have the mandatory search and the supported search. So we describe what's recommended and what you got to support. So we have two parts to US Core. And so, and I just want to take a brief moment here, just mention that, this guide, US Core, as well as Argonaut, can be used in a couple of ways. And so for some applications, for some implementations, you're going to use just only the profiles. In other words, you're going to adopt the content model, but not the interactions. An example of that is that, for example, if you know anything about FHIR, there's this bulk data specification, which is that supports the US Core data for interoperability, where you just simply exporting resources. There's no need to have a search API. So there is a dual function to this guide. It provides the structural content. Then there's another way to use it, and this is where for systems that certify to the 2015 Cures update, they're going to be conforming to the profile, which means they're going to support both the content, as in the first use case, as well as the interactions. So we have, for each section, we have the quick start guide. Okay, and in addition to having profiles, and search, we're going to have a lot of guidance in the guide. And we have several pages of guidance. We have a general guidance section, and at the top of that page, we just map it to the USCDI, or the US Core Data elements for interoperability, to the US Core profile mappings. So the data elements in USCDI will correlate to a profile in US Core. There's other sections in there that talks about syntax and missing data and all kinds of topics, including provenance and clinical notes and a bunch of other stuff. So here we have another example I wanted to go through, because this gives highlights some other features that are in US Core. So here's the US Core patient profile, the kind of the base profile that you're going to have to support US Core, because it's all patient focused. So we have this US Core patient, and as we go down the left-hand column there, look at the first couple of elements. Those actually are extensions, something called an extension, and I mentioned those before. Those are things that aren't in the base spec. We add them in using this mechanism called extensions. And you can see the first couple ones there, race and ethnicity. That's something that's a US-specific requirement and something that we track in the United States. And so these are two important extensions for US Core, because they define and use the terminology that's defined for race and ethnicity for a lot of reporting in clinical care. And there's a birth sex extension as well. That's also a US specific requirement. And we mentioned the quick start section again. Here it is for patient, and you can see, just to reiterate, we have some mandatory search parameters. You shall support this particular parameter, as well as suggested search parameters that you should support. We kind of wrap all this stuff. I think we'll get this slide in a second, but I'll just mention now. We formalize all these shoulds and shalls in something called a capability statement, which is a statement of conformance that we list all the expectations in that single artifact. It's a FHIR artifact, and give a nice narrative that describes it all in a single page, that describes all the expectations. This is a guide, it's an implementation guide. So implementation guide has expectations, and actual implementation would take those expectations and turn them into actual capabilities. But in this guide, we just list all the expectations, put all those little shoulds and shalls next to them so that you can see what's expected for each of the actors. And there's two actors in US Core. Basically, you have a server, a data source, that's an EHR basically, and then you have a client, some application out there that's trying to retrieve data for an end user, which is oftentimes a patient, could be a provider as well. So we provide capability statements for both. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me just talk about value set terminology and value sets. So we have defined a lot of codes, or what codes to use in FHIR, and we have a couple. Just in general sense, we have a couple. We have these are called intrinsic codes. These are codes that are algorithmically defined, and we're using codes from common clinical terminologies such as SNOMED and LOINC and in this case ICD-10, ICD-9 to define certain codes. We also have a set of codes that we call extrinsic. We're just listing the codes out. For example, in the smoking status value set. Those are just a set of codes that are enumerated directly. But we define all these codes for every place where there are codes defined, or, and this is part of the work is some of these things are defined by regulations. Others we've hashed out through our work with all the partners, the vendors, and the FHIR community and HL7 community to define a lot of these codes. And so we have a lot of value sets, 20 plus value sets, and in the future, the hope and the dream is we'll be hosting more and more of these value sets externally on something called VSAC, which is a terminology authority supported by our federal government. And that will help decouple the terminology, which may update at a different schedule than it would, for example, in the guides updates. Because terminology, for example, the common terminology is SNOMED CT, which is a common clinical terminology, as well as a link update every 6 months. So that helps decouple these things, and then those can be more up to date. It also helps, managing terminology versus managing publication of implementation guides. That's enough. So I mentioned the capability statements before. There are 2 in this guide, one for the server and one for the client. And again, these are expectations and versus the actual instances. So if you are a server or a client, you can list your capability statements and define what you actually support. In this case, we're defining all those profiles and all the interactions that are required for those profiles. Here's an example of US Core Patient. And you can see it shows what you shall support. You should support search, you support read, and then there's other cases where you may want to support it or should support it. And so these, again, supporting this capability statement, what's unique about this and in implementation guides is you're describing expectations, what you need to do, what you should do, what you shall do. And so here we can see where we list all the search parameters in the capability statements, because again, it's not only profiles in US Core, but it's profiles in a search API. So you can see here we have a lot of combination search parameters that are supported, and we have a few individual search parameters that are supported as well. So we wanted to make sure that was all in one place and to be able to be consumed by the reader. Okay, so I mentioned extensions before, and one place where you saw they were used was on the page, and the only place I think we really use them is on patient resource, but they're important ones. We have the US Core race and ethnicity and US Core birth sex, and we developed these extensions, and they are based on existing work in CCDA, so they actually are kind of the same. They actually mimic the requirements in what CCDA means. I'm getting my acronyms mixed up. That's the Brett, help me real quick. CCDA.
It's the document exchange formalism, consolidated clinical document architecture,
which is widely adopted. So we wanted to make sure we were in alignment with that. Okay, so switching gears for a little bit, we have the ONC's USCDI and those common data elements for interoperability. So here's an instance where this is actually talking about how USCDI and US Core interact. Well, here's an instance where USCDI got a little bit ahead of US Core. We published US Core version 3.1.0, and lo and behold, it did not contain a profile for the percentile head circumference. We had a head circumference measurement, but it wasn't percentage. So that triggered a set of changes, which we turned into an errata release, version 3.1.1. And we added, not only did we add that, but we had a few other big changes we put into there for that. So you can see that this is a constantly evolving process where we're constantly reevaluating and looking at not only regulations, but other things to see how we can improve US Core. So we had a bunch of trackers for that, but we now have a new, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, we have a new version that we balloted following this errata that's going to have even more changes. Good changes, not bad changes, all good changes. And so there were instances where US Core was actually ahead of the USCDI, and a couple of those where we were first on the block with some guidance around provenance and encounter and clinical notes. So the bottom line there is you can see that US Core is not equivalent to USCDI. Sometimes we're ahead, sometimes, like I showed in the previous slide, sometimes we lag a little bit behind. So it's basically a game of leapfrog here. We're just trying to be in alignment, but sometimes, we're being pushed by USCDI changes, and sometimes I don't know if we're pulling them, but we're creating new content that may not be in USCDI, and it may actually find its way in there, but it's not like, so I wouldn't say we're pulling, we're providing content that doesn't always, that's sometimes ahead of the game when it comes to USCDI. Okay, so this is a bit of information for everybody. So the Office of National Coordinator has this standards version advancement process, and it allows IT developers to voluntarily adopt more advanced versions of the standard in anticipation or not of new regulations, but this is a voluntary effort. And then we have a roadmap. Next slide, Brett. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm skipping my slides here. Let's see, so this is the system. It's just a little informational blurb on how you submit new data elements to get for consideration to be adopted in that process that we talked about before.
And Eric and I snuck these two slides in from ONC on the standards version advancement process and on deck. For folks who aren't familiar with USCDI, it's something that ONC plans to grow over the years. And if you're looking forward to July as much as I am, not just for summer barbecue and swimming, but USCDI Final 2 is coming out too. So we're looking forward to that and the conversations that will come in potential development for US Core.
Yes. Okay. I think I was actually, I'm looking at that slide thing. I was expecting a different slide. Anyway. Okay. So how does something get added to US Core? That's a question we get a lot. Now, US Core is not a mechanism to get your great new profile or a new idea out there to the public. We're not a shortcut to getting adoption. We want the other way around. We want to be a lagging indicator, not the leading indicator. I have to say that if you do want to get your great new profile in it, and you have the weight of the federal government behind you, yes, it'll get into US Core pretty quickly, because if there's a new law, obviously we're gonna focus on that and make that a priority. But for other projects, other programs, if you create a new profile, get a lot of wide adoption, pilot it, and you can prove that it has the weight of the community behind it, then certainly we're going to add it to US Core. We're not a shortcut to getting people to use it. We're the last in that process. We're going to be the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. So if anybody thinks, oh, we'll just put in US Core and get everybody to adopt it, that's not going to happen unless you want. No. Okay, so here's the roadmap I was thinking of before. So we have this game of leapfrog, and so as Brett mentioned, there's going to be a review and response for USCDI Draft 2, I believe, is coming up, and that's already in process, and it'll be finalized in July. Once that's finalized, we'll pick up that ball, take a look at it, and discuss it with the community and see if we need to make additions to US Core. And then we'll take US Core back to a ballot. The HL7 has a balloting process, so we take it back to ballot at the beginning of next year, and then resolve those ballot comments. Meanwhile, ONC will be having another round of more USCDI updates, and then that cycle will continue. So we'll try to be, kind of in this game of leapfrog, trying to keep up to date with any of those changes. Brett, did you want to say anything more about that? That's actually Brett's little roadmap, so he might have some.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the pieces here to take away is we're trying to have a regular, just like, we tip our hat to ONC for having a regular release cycle for USCDI. We're also trying to do that for US Core and lagging US Core. So just, goal is to ballot US Core every January, kind of winter timeframe. And so for folks who are doing pilot testing or work and want to prove support that, they have good community buy-in, the time to submit those, the time to start working on, of course, is now, but they'd be taken up for consideration in the kind of winter timeframe.
Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, and we talked about here, we are in the midst of resolving ballot comments from a January ballot this year. We had over 90 plus open trackers. many meetings and a lot of great comments and a lot of help from our friends over at the HL7. And hats off to them for really helping us move this process along. And so we're just finishing up applying all these trackers. We hope, keep our fingers crossed, my fingers crossed. We'll hope we'll have something up by the end of the month. Because we're just finalizing some of the final trackers and doing some QA work as we speak. A couple of the highlights there, we're adding new conformance expectations to clarify most supports. We have a large section of conformance now that talks about and how to read it, how to interpret these conformance things. Kind of deep into details, but that's a big change. And then again, supporting structure versus supporting the whole API. Okay. So I think I'm going to give it over to Brett right now. Let me see if I have any more slides here. Oh, go ahead, Brett.
Sure. So I think part of the, one good thing about a ballot is you get formal commenting. So we take comments anytime. Ideally you log them through HL7's Jira tracking process, but you can put them in chat.fire, reach out to Eric and I. And one of the things that's great is the last ballot we had lots of work with the Inferno team has combed through it, Rob and the MITRE team. And logged lots of good comments. And important to know, this is just one testing tool that's out there. It has a formal certification program edition if you're actually trying to certify your product, but then there's a community edition to do implementation guides. And also another fun little resource validator where you can just paste in your own resource to see how it validates if you link it to your appropriate guide. And there'll be a whole session on this at DevDays. Check the agenda on Inferno.
Yeah, I just checked the agenda. And it's called FHIR API Testing with Inferno. It's today, 12:15 to 1 p.m. And of course, there'll probably be a video.
And Eric's on Pacific time, so for those of you at East Coast, 3:15. So where are we headed? At the Argonaut community, we meet at the end of every year, kind of look back. We try to keep our projects to a 1 year. Try to take chunks or bites of 1 year. And so looking forward to 2021, we launched this kind of late spring, 2 projects. But FHIR Write, there's minimal guidance on how to write and update data in the context of USCDI profiles, not just for provider write, but patient write. And so we're currently exploring what that guidance would look like. Spending a lot of time on scoping, whether it'll be devices, patients bring their own devices, prescribed devices, a whole kind of nailing down the exact scope on this one's gonna be tricky to get it done in the year, but actively working on that. Join us if you're available. And also subscriptions. So Gino Canessa has been working on subscriptions the last couple of years, and the Argonaut community took it a few years ago to accelerate it. But it's not quite done in the backcourt. There's a little bit of work to be done, and so the Argonaut community decided to give it a second go, which we've done a few times on projects to say, hey, we did it for a year, we took a year off, let's give it another good to try to bring it all the way to the finish line. And so lots of good work happened with Gino. So if you're interested in subscriptions, there's a talk on that this week too. But again, it's another opportunity for folks to participate. Other projects under consideration: native app security best practices. Josh Mandel's giving me a talk on Smart on FHIR and granular controls, and we've added some additional kind of best practices to the spec. Best practices through the ballot process, since that had balloted the cycle. We did a little bit of experiment with smart scheduling links this spring and some discussions, but other things out there: electronic health information export and USCDI version 2 testing. We'll see. Sometimes we kick things off mid-year, and this feels like it might be this year. But just to pause to kind of wrap up the conversation on US Core, the Argonauts, if we write new kind of content guides, we're following the same rules as other accelerators in that, we'll only try to add them to US Core after we get good experience and good feedback. So we don't plan to write new kind of content guides on their own. We're going to try, we may write kind of pilot guides, but our goal is to fold like FHIR Write, depending on how far we get this year, hopefully propose that as a future update to US FHIR Core, assuming we progress up those steps. And so we're really pushing to, encourage folks to use US FHIR Core, and we're doing that ourselves. So before we wrap up here, one of the things, I think a few folks have seen this before, but, in interoperability, I have just a little interoperability thought experiment, and I think it's part of the whole US Core spec is built, a huge portion of it is built on discrete data. And I think there's this kind of natural tug of war of discrete data versus narrative. And so one of the examples, I think some of us either have, our own children or nieces or nephews who are in childcare or situations where, you may get data on them. And this is my son, Edison, and the poor kid has been pulled through a lot of daycares over the years. And in one particular daycare, we would get text messages and alerts through this app on, exactly when he used the potty, what he ate, what he didn't eat. You can see how many minutes he slept. We'd get notes on him, doing playground time or gym class, and it was great. And throughout the day, my wife and I, kind of turn the alerts off, but you could say, oh, look all right, he ate lunch. All right, he should, maybe needs a snack, but, looks like he had a decent day. But when you picked him up, all you got was this data. There was no kind of handoff, kind of transition home. And so we didn't actually know, like, how did his day go? Was Edison in a good mood? Did a friend bite him? Like, because that happens occasionally. So it's a big question of, what happened. So this is one situation. Another situation was, we didn't get data, but we got narrative. And so I'll just read this. We got this, a couple times a week, and it said, today after returning from our walk, Edison told us he wanted to put the boot bin away. I told him he could help if he got undressed, but he dawdled. I reminded him a couple of times if he wanted to put the bin away, he would need to get undressed. He chose to watch other children and roll on the floor. So eventually I let him know that I was going to invite other children to put it away. He got very upset and he actually cried. We've seen some other experimental behaviors from Edison, so we're working with Edison to link his actions to the consequences. Edison remembered those things from the past, and so we hark back onto those moments to help explain why I should cooperate or do as we ask. And this was great because we could have a conversation with Edison about the shoe bin and have a little prep of how it went. But we didn't actually know, like, did he eat anything that day? Did he nap at all? And so it always left us wanting some more. And so it was great to have the narrative, but we really missed the data when this is all we got. And ironically, we went to a third daycare. This is over the course of 5 years. We're not, crazy parents pulling our kids around, but we had to move a lot for a few years. And one daycare gave us this, like, we weren't there when the teachers left. And so if we didn't, have a phone call teacher, we actually had no idea what was going on. And so it was very difficult. And I think the reality is for folks who are navigating their own healthcare, sometimes you have data, sometimes you have notes, sometimes you have nothing. But the point I want to emphasize here is don't lose the story of the patient or the person you're taking care of. So it's not just about data. It's trying to, make sure that the future clinician or future caregiver has the story of the person they're doing. And part of that we're really happy about with US Core is the addition of clinical notes. So we have the common clinical note set of consultation or discharge summary, some very basic guidance on progress note, but this is an enabling. It's not limited to these notes. It's a pathway to add any number of note types. And also the spec supports a variety of formats. So text, XML, if you have to use PDF, but all the way up to mixed, CDA documents or, FHIR documents, just using composition. So that's it. That's the plug on narrative and data. But as we wrap this up, we're a community. The FHIR community, as you watch the opening kickoff, is growing over the last 10 years. And we're so excited to have you here. Find your home. There's lots of good talks this week. If you want to participate in the Argonaut initiatives of this year or want to participate in US Core, check out the Zulip. If you haven't logged into Zulip, there's a stream for Argonaut. You can find us there. There's an Argonaut Confluence page at HL7. But whether you participate in Argonaut or any of the other initiatives, the important thing is the specs are only as good as the feedback that you, the developer and the implementer, give to us, or the clinician who's using the software or having to solve a particular complex use case. It's only as good as the feedback that you give to folks writing the spec. And so we need you. And so thank you, and we hope you have a great Dev Days.
Thank you so much, Brett. That's really good. There are some great questions in the chat. Let me.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, good. Let me hand you a few. Maybe start with a light one. So this is a really leading project, right? So people look up to US Core. This is one of the most important standards within the FHIR community, I'd say. Why do you still call yourself not a standards organization if you're selling these kind of industry-wide IGs?
It's a great, it's a good question. And, the Argonaut product that we put out, we consider, anything that we published within quote Argonaut, is just a publication of implementer best practices. Once it goes through the HL7 machinery, so US Core actually goes through the machinery of the standards development organization of HL7, and then it does become a formal standard, and then it can be adopted by regulation and broadly adopted.
Okay, so because you're both following and setting standards, it's a bit in between.
So yeah, I would say like we're proposing a set of guides, and then there's this very formal process that we work through with HL7. So Argonaut, you know, we support.
So your standards proposing organization.
That's right. That's right.
And people heard you about this leapfrogging between US Core and USCDI. And Daniel Tam asks, given this leapfrogging, what is the best way a FHIR server should operate? Like, should we look at the difference between US Core and USCDI, and then if there's any differences between them, should we like temporarily already implement them with like extensions and other profiles?
It's a reasonable question. I mean, I think if you've implemented, so first off, I'd say implement the existing US Core. The one that we publish in June will be beyond what's available in USCDI. So that'd be my initial target. Then in July, when ONC publishes their draft, you could start to add that functionality, or I suspect either the Argonaut community or HL7 will pick up and have a formal kind of work group to try to iron out how to do that, because ONC will say, we want to do this new data element, maybe this new terminology, but they don't get down to the, intentionally so, the very nitty gritty must support terminology, all those pieces. And so I would say watch for the work group in July to pick up and join, or August, or whenever it launches. I'm sure by September, you know, join us to do that design work.
Yeah, and this is Eric, and yeah, I want to reiterate that. You know, when we say leapfrogging, is, I mean, I think the gaps are small at this point, and you know what's new in USCDI may or may not be taken up by what's new in US Core may or may not be taken up by USCD. But I foresee, and I can't guarantee this, but anything that's in USCDI, we certainly are going to take a look at closely in US Core and try to you know get it in publication, like that roadmap that we put up there speaks to. You know, we have like this 6-month lag that we can catch up.
Great. So you recommend take the upcoming US Core version and then stay involved in the process.
We want your feedback because we want the feedback. You know, like the feedback. Like, if, you know, feel free to start. You know, whatever ONC publishes, if you can start exploring it yourself and say, "Oh, there should be an extension, this new resource." Like, we want that feedback.
Yeah, great. Maybe then a final question: how does US Core correlate to other international standards like IPS and such? Are you looking at those?
It's a really good question, Ward. And I think it's something that, you know, IPS had a very document-centric base in CDA and composition based. And so there's a great project starting at HL7, the International Patient Access, hopefully, or accessibility, one of those two. You know, I myself am greatly interested in it. I'm hoping that the lessons of, I mean, clearly we need to, you know, reevaluate some of the decisions we made in US Core for an international perspective, but I think that new IPA specification is a very important one, and one that I'm hoping we can share lessons back and forth to make a really robust international product.
Great, good. Well, I think we've covered most of the questions. There are some new ones, maybe you should look at them quickly. The US Core spec allows for huge data sets to be returned. Is there any way for a FHIR server to conform without implementing pagination? Say returning results, the top 1,000.
Well, that's a technical question, but we have in the spec, we have some guidance surrounding, you know, pagination. Okay. I'm not sure how we can answer that right away. We can probably. I
think that's probably good enough. Yeah. And to the rest, I would like to say, Brett and Eric will probably look at the questions in the chat and go over them. Thank you very much, both.
Thank you.
Thank you.